I think part of the problem with having a conversation with the end goal is that the work is never done. Part of the problem is also you can't identify the end goal because any disparity in outcome is just assumed to be racist. That's the de facto. If there is a disparity in outcome, race has to be but not in everything, not in, for example, people who collect garbage. Or people who have higher risks of death, truckers or something, or on death row, which is almost exclusively male. So I think that
Yes, nobody says we need more female representation on death row.
That's correct. So I think that the key here is, what does it mean to have an equitable system as opposed to what it means to have a system in which we treat people equally?
Yes, yeah. This is the absolute heart of the issue, isn't it? We could get, I don't want to sound Panglossian, but we could get almost total agreement, it seems to me, in American society on the idea that people should have an equal shot in their lives. I think that's a pretty good aspiration.
Right, and I'll give them what they're looking for. And this is where I think many conservatives have fallen. The idea that we can and should just pick ourselves up by our own bootstraps, that's a good idea. But it's far easier to do that if we have systems based upon fairness. For example, it's far easier to do that if everyone has a public education of the first rate, a la John Rawls. So the more there's a disparity in those starting conditions, and I would argue that it's primarily economic, which breaks down race as a proxy to that economic conditions. The solution to me seems to be fairness.
The
equality of opportunity as opposed to equality of outcome. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for equity. They want to advance equity, particularly the readjustment of shares as one's previous, quote unquote, racial history factors into it.
Yes, so long as it's always in a beneficial light. We are so confused as a society now on all of this, aren't we? We are so confused. Most people, I think, would hear the words equality and equity as synonyms.
Right.
I think
Joe Biden, in fact, in the debate,
right,
didn't know the meanings of those terms.
I think it's really troubling when very, very important distinctions are so little understood. Do we want an equal society? Yes, in many ways. Do we want a society where every profession has exactly the correct representation within it, depending on racial and other character traits of the general population, so that if you have less than 13% of the workforce in any sector of the economy, you've got to...
Right. We'd need some governing body to mandate that, and that would separate people from their own proclivities and interests.
Yes. It means that if you didn't have exactly 13% of black employees,
right,
you would have to make sure you fired some employees of other races and put some black people in. It would also, of course, and this is the element that nobody ever wants to focus on, it would mean that if you had 19% of black employees in your firm, you'd have to get rid of some people who were black because they were black, because otherwise the whole racial quota system didn't work, which of course opens up the same thing which is highlighted by the lack of female engineers, the lack of female firefighters, and much more, which is you probably can't do that unless it seemed to be in an area which it's desirable to be in by society at this moment, including highly remunerated jobs, high prestige jobs, and much more. That's, by the way, one of the reasons why every time that the equity discussion comes up and it's around the media or Hollywood, I just put my head in my hands, because I just think that these are the least typical professions imaginable and very bad places to play what remaining equality issues there are in society out, because almost nothing can be played at that level.
It seems to be a bizarre way to just think about things in the first place.
I think we should try to find problems that we could agree on and could solve. That's my view. For instance, I think we could agree on the following proposition across right and left, such as those boundaries exist. We could agree that, for instance, nobody in their lives should be held back from attaining a position they should or could attain, simply held back because of characteristics over which they have no say.
But we could only agree with that if our starting value isn't equity.
Yes, absolutely. And it would, of course, rely on, well, I mean, there are other things. It keeps certain people down who don't have the ability to perform a task. But the one I think we could agree on would be everybody capable of performing a certain task should be able to achieve that role in spite of any character traits in which they have no say. So, all the polling data in my own country, in the United Kingdom, like here in America, shows that there's pretty much total agreement on this. Very few people still think that a woman who's the best qualified person for a role shouldn't get the role because she's a woman.
Right.
Very few people in this society now think that, a choice of two people for a job, one's white, one's black, the black person is clearly better qualified for the role, you shouldn't give him the role because he's black. There's very little of this around in our societies now, despite the catastrophizing claims of some of the social justice activists. But if we said, that's what we're aiming for, we're just aiming to get to a place where immutable characteristics do not dictate what you can achieve in your life, and
should not.
And once we've got there, and if we're not there yet, and you could argue that we're not, but once we're there, we'd like that ground to be held. We don't want any snap back on it at any point. We could agree on that. The problem, the really sincere debate that is going on in our time, which we know too few people identify, is that there is a serious difference of opinion over how that is achieved. And that, broadly speaking, portions of the left say it should be achieved by forcing quota systems, for instance, on everything from universities to boards of corporations. And the right answer is, I say this myself, is to an extent unsatisfactory, which is to say, don't push these things because it'll come out naturally anyway, so long as the Rawlsian preconditions are in place, so long as people have got a good education, they'll get there. Now, as it happens, I think both of those arguments have something to be said for them. But if you only believe the first of those two, then you create this world of pain.
The other thing is it causes poaching at the top of those minority communities. So the best people within those communities, they'll be highly fought over, but the people who are not as proficient or adept or lack those skill sets, what happens to them? And then don't you think that there's something that's alienating socially, that someone would say, well, they're only in that position because they're in certain immutable characteristics?
Oh, sure.
And think about how one would feel as a talented black person, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. This is...
it's unbelievably humiliating and insulting.
This is one of my many reasons for objecting to all of this, which is that it makes everyone suspicious of everyone else. It means that everybody who is in a particular position, their colleagues might be weighing them up as to whether or not they were a diversity hire or not.
Right.
Somebody once pointed out to me that when at an American university in the 1960s or 70s, when you saw a black student colleague, if you were white, you knew that student was damn bright, because among much else, they'd had to get through more hoops.
Right.
And then you get to the current status, and the same person said, they couldn't help thinking that exactly the reverse might be the case.
And couple that with the fact that they could never say that. So we have many, many people who are thinking that, and it's festering, and and they're thinking that. And I happen to believe, I don't know if you believe this, but I happen to think that there's no such thing as a private belief. If you intensely believe something, like, and you can't speak about it, you can't engage in a dialogue, because then you could be accused of being a Nazi or racist. But you're thinking, well, geez, why is that black person in that situation? Are they affirmative actioned in? I can't help but to think the inevitable consequence of that would be you would treat them differently. And that is a stain on all of us.
Yes, and then you get the problem of the hierarchies that you create in the name of justice that simply create greater inequality.
Right.
I mean, inequality is more of a concern to the political left than it is to the political right for all sorts of reasons. But such as there is an argument about it, this game, the identity politics game, is a horrible place to address inequality, because you get the problems that I identify as being, for instance, a board or a university needs to improve its black or female or LGBT quota. The people they're likely to get, that they're going to reach out to, are, for instance, the woman who was about to be promoted anyway, or highly likely to be promoted anyway, the already very well educated black student, or indeed, in many of these cases, an already very privileged, in economic terms, student. I say this in my own country as being the issue of reaching out for diversity and getting a black old Etonian.
Interesting.
What have you actually done in this, other than create what appears to be a diverse board or a diverse student body or a diverse workforce, when in actual fact all you have done is just create a new privileged, if in one way diverse class of person? And you've got, for instance, zero class mobility, no working class representation at all. Or you get to the stage where you have no viewpoint diversity, because everybody is essentially from the same relatively privileged milieu.